Welcome to the Affirming Village podcast, where we center neurodivergent voices, affirm diverse ways of being, and empower families, educators, and advocates with knowledge that truly honors the whole learner. We're your co-hosts, Dr. Destiny Huff, a late diagnosed autistic ADHD mental health therapist and non-attorney special education advocate, and Lisa Wright, an ADHD and dyslexic educator and IEP coach. Together, we dig into conversations about neuroaffirming practices, special education, and disability rights. Please remember, nothing shared on this podcast is medical or legal advice, and the views shared here by the host and the guest are their personal opinions. This space is for educational purposes only, to help you feel informed, empowered, and never alone in the village. Hello, welcome back to the Affirming Village podcast. Today's episode is operating with fidelity. What does that actually mean? So today we're talking about a phrase that shows up in education all the time, especially in IEP meetings, evaluation reports, and intervention conversations. And that phrase is operating with fidelity.
Yes. If you have ever sat in an IEP meeting, you've probably heard something like, we need to implement the IEP with fidelity, or our IEP process is always done with fidelity.
And on the surface, that sounds like a really good thing, right? Because fidelity is supposed to mean, keyword supposed to, that something is being implemented the way it was designed.
But what we want to talk about today is how that phrase is often used and how it sometimes becomes a way to protect a program instead of actually looking at whether or not the learner is being supported and provided meaningful access to their education.
Exactly, because the conversation can shift from, is this working for the learner, to did we follow the program correctly?
And those are two very different questions.
They are. And in special education, what actually matters is fidelity to the IEP and fidelity to the learner, not just fidelity to the program.
Exactly. So today we are going to unpack what fidelity is supposed to mean, where it breaks down in practice, and what families and educators should really be looking for when they hear that phrase.
Because at the end of the day, the goal isn't proving the system worked.
The goal is making sure the learner can actually access their education. Yeah. So Destiny and I were trying to figure out like what sort of made sense as like a next topic for the podcast. And the last two episodes, in case you missed them, were really about ego and how ego kinds of shows up, and sort of broadly in episode 18, and then more specifically when like kind of one specific team member is sort of undercutting the process because their ego is showing.
Mm-hmm.
And so this felt sort of like a natural path to continue on, because when we start to question the fidelity of how an IEP is being implemented, that is a very quick way to get defensiveness and ego to show up in the room. If it isn't already
right?
there.
Because when we start talking about fidelity, we are talking about them a lot of times following those procedural pieces, right, of FAPE. So for those that are listening and learning, we always like to explain terms. So, FAPE is free and appropriate public education, and this is something that all learners are entitled to that are in special education and that are on 504 plans. And then when we talk about procedural, when you look at substantive or procedural violations, procedural is specifically talking to the process. Okay, so we're saying that every state has their own timeline for when they're supposed to respond to a request for a special education evaluation. They have a timeline for when they were supposed to hold the initial evaluation results meeting and the initial IEP meeting. I know California does assessment plans and they hold a meeting. Not all states have an assessment plan meeting, or at least they don't call it that. But we're talking about those timelines and those things that are supposed to be implemented by a certain amount of time, or that they're just providing your learner with their specifically designed instruction or specifically or specialized academic instruction, or they are following the accommodations. So immediately, if you have, especially if you have a program specialist, a compliance specialist, a special ed director in the room, they're going to immediately jump on any time you start talking about the term fidelity.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I've had this come up, and I'm sure you have as well, in like so many different scenarios that like my brain is just sort of popcorning all over the place, where I've had it used almost as a way to like distance. Like I had a program specialist using this phrase to almost distance himself from having to make a decision that in terms of providing a service
Mm-hmm.
that he didn't really have the authority to make. And so he was actually kind of trying to stall. And so he was sort of trying to get the family to agree to like the assessment process and right, like,
Mm-hmm.
and he just kept saying, we have to do this with fidelity. We have to do this with fidelity. And I was like, you missed up so many times before we got here that you haven't done anything with fidelity yet. But those are details. So I actually have a running joke with that parent, and if she's listening to this, she's laughing because she knows that it's actually hard for me to say the phrase, we need to implement the IEP with fidelity without laughing and actually thinking about that IEP meeting.
No, but I think what you're talking about too is like getting into those pieces where us as advocates, right, stepping into situations, we've been in all types of situations and supported all types of families with all types of needs. And seeing, going back to that kind of bias or going back to that gaslighting at the IEP table, seeing terms used in, if you're coming in out of context, you're going, no, 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 yeah, we got to do this with fidelity, right? But we have seen those terms used, like you said, to delay decisions, to, not make decisions, to kind of gaslight the family into thinking this is something they have to do. I think when I hear the term fidelity, I also think of situations where the family has been like, hey, we're supposed to have this annual, we're supposed to have this annual, we're supposed to have this annual, right? And finally, when they get reached out to, it's like, well, we have to have this annual in 2 days, or the learner's IEP is out of compliance, and that impacts their services. And the parents like, oh my gosh, we have to do it. And I'm just like, that is not what that means at all.
Right.
They're out of compliance. That's a them issue. They're going to have to answer to the state for that. They're going to have to justify why they didn't hold the IEP by a certain time. But that doesn't impact your learner being able to have access to their services because they didn't hold the annual meeting when they're supposed to, which is the one meeting you are required by the Individuals with Disability Education Act, IDEA, to hold once a year. So I think that's what I think about when you say that, is I think about how many times a parent is like freaking out because they're like, they said I have to have this meeting at this time, but they just told me that, 3 days ago, or that I have to hold it next week, and my work schedule or life schedule is not set up that way.
Right, right, exactly. We could use a different expression that we hear, or the IEP is going to expire. I'm using air quotes that anybody who's not watching on YouTube, right? And so families panic. They're like, oh my gosh, right? And to me, like when I think of the expression, we need to engage in this process with fidelity, like I, I believe that, right? And so to
Mm-hmm.
me, waiting until the last minute and essentially ambushing a family with this like, oh crap, I didn't look at my calendar and didn't realize. And it happens, right? Folks,
Mm-hmm.
case managers are carrying heavy, heavy loads, they're pulled in a million
Mm-hmm.
directions. I'm not suggesting things can't happen,
Mm-hmm.
but like your poor planning is not my emergency.
That's all I'm saying. I've had it where a family might even come in and go, okay, I have this annual coming up. As they're getting closer, they come and they go do a consult. And they're like, I just don't know if I can handle it on my own. There's been a lot of issues I want to address, because most families don't have a meeting all year. They don't have it until their
True.
annual. They either have it at the beginning of the year and then they're like, there's issues and I think we need to address it. So now I would like to bring someone in. And a lot of times that comes down to the disconnected communication of them thinking they can only have a meeting on their annual, right?
Right.
Um, and so they'll be like, oh, I want to have this meeting. And then I've even had it where it's like, well, because you want an advocate there, we have to have someone from the district there. Because we have to have someone from the district there, we have to reschedule this meeting. And so now we're looking at being out of compliance, right? And I'm like, again, that's not their problem, right?
Right. And as long as you're communicating with the district and trying to get something on the books, nobody's expiring. It's all good. Let's act in good faith, right? Um, no, it's just so true. And I feel like kind of similar because there's obvious overlap, but similar to the gaslighting episode where we talked about like some folks say things that land as really dismissive, but they really don't know and they're not intending harm. And then there's other folks that actually like know the rules of engagement and they're kind of weaponizing whatever they're weaponizing. Like there's just very
Mhm.
different intent. I
Mhm.
feel like it happens with this idea of like following the process with fidelity and or like implementing the plan itself with fidelity, right? And I actually feel like this is an area of frustration for a lot of families, right? Like you're saying, the scenario, which is a common scenario, where the family thinks I'm only allowed to have this annual meeting. So they're sort of sitting in their frustration, not feeling listened to, or there's gaps in communication, or they're whatever, right? Things are a brewing and they realize, oh gosh, okay, I've got this meeting, I got this notification. Oh my goodness, I don't want to go in there alone. Let me reach out for help, right? Oh my God, I just totally lost my train of thought. Hi, ADHD. Have a giggle, everybody who's listening. um, oh my God, it's like totally gone. That's hysterical. I'm trying
Well,
to
I
do too
mean,
many things at one time. Destiny,
yeah,
do you know what I was trying to say? Are your
no,
telepathy
but we
skills
are
working?
neurodivergent here, so I'm not, so it is what it is. Like, but no, but
Not
picking up
bad.
picking up on what you're saying, if it comes back, just slide it and say it. Like, yes, that is a point of contention that happens for a lot of families, and I think that's when you get into that ill intent part, right? Because they're using it intentionally. They know that the parent is going to
Thank
be
you. Yes.
flooded, nervous system flooded, and like I can't think. And so now I'm gonna move heaven and earth because my kid needs this service and they need their services, and I don't want that taken away, even if they're shitty, right? Because sometimes that's an issue too, but I don't want to lose the
Right.
IEP, so I'm gonna push everything out of the way to accommodate. And it's like that helps no one because it's not even then you're not even having a productive meeting.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. It sort of came back half baked. I think the direction, so help me, so help me, Lord. I think the direction that I was going is that sometimes, oh, I got it. It came back. Sometimes we have this meeting, right? So we're sitting in frustration, we seek out for help, we get that help, we come in, we do engage in a really lovely collaborative IEP process. So I would say we engage in the process with fidelity. And then the implementation falters. And so then that frustration almost grows exponentially because it's like, hey, wait a second. I just invested in some help. Or maybe they're listening to this podcast and getting all the good tips and doing it alone. But either way, right? Like they have a meeting where they're like, we put our heads together. It was really good, right? And we wrote things down and I got a new goal in place or I got a new service in place or whatever it is that you were hoping for to remove barriers of access for your learner. And you're like, yes. And then it's like, right? And it's not implemented with fidelity. And so then you're like, God damn it. Right? Like, now I have to come back to the table. And so then you feel like, as the parent, like you're having to sort of be this micromanager, right? And it fractures and breaks down trust because it's like we had this great conversation and like I'm totally gonna date myself here, but it's like the Wendy's commercial from the 80s that Destiny, you were just too sweet of a pea to remember, of the three little old ladies of like, where's the beef? Right? Where families are like, what the hell? Like, where is the program? And that's in my head part of what I think about in terms of like the fidelity piece is great. We've got this great behavior plan, or great, we have all these wonderful accommodations, or we have these great conversations. But maybe the piece we missed was really discussing what the actual like action plan or implementation plan would be so that we can continue on like engaging in a process with integrity.
Absolutely. And I think just to like kind of go back, because I was thinking, when we talked about mentioning fidelity, right? Because we talked about how there are these procedural pieces to it. Um, but just to what we're getting at there when we talk about what do we mean by implementing the IEP with fidelity? We're talking about following what is written in the IEP consistently,
Yes.
okay? And
Yes.
delivering FAPE. That's what we're talking about. And so if it says that this learner, and I'm seeing this more and more with a lot of states, which really irritates me to no end, but if it says this learner is supposed to get so many hours of speech over 30 weeks or the year or the quarter, like they're getting more and more like, we're going to put this over this large span, where I'm just like, how are you even looking at if it's effective? But whatever, then that's what it's supposed to be, right? And so what Lisa is getting at is that it's that when you take the time to hold the meeting, to show up, to give your input, I always say, and you'll hear me say to the end of time, parents of disabled learners are the most they research the most, they look the most, they're up late the most. I can't tell you how many consult things I get at like midnight.
Oh,
Um,
sure.
because they're scrolling, looking, trying to figure out how to support their learner. And so that's what that means with fidelity. And so when you get in that meeting and then you find out something has not been done with fidelity, or, they're skirting around the issue, or a lot of times when I think about Lisa mentioning like like a program specialist or compliance specialist, like I said, a special education director coming in from the district, what really upsets me as an advocate and as a parent is when they come in and go, we do everything with fidelity. And I'm like, sometimes, not all the time, and I say this all the time because advocates are hired for different reasons. Sometimes I'm hired because the parents like, look, I need someone to draft all my stuff. Sometimes I just need someone at the meeting so that's like honed in on all the little, nooks and crannies and making sure like every box is checked and all that. And then sometimes it's because they're not fucking following the IEP with fidelity. And so to come in and go, we follow things with fidelity, or like, let's not, and I'm not, me and Lisa have talked about this, both of our advocacy styles are similar in that, like, we're not a come in and attack the team. We're not a come in and burn the bridges. We're talking about collaborating and communicating. But when you're outside looking in and you step into the meeting and then you try to either say fidelity is happening when we know it's not, or subsequently say, well, I think, we can give some understanding for this, then it has to be a two-way street in that understanding. And a lot of times I think that's where
100%.
parents get frustrated. It's like, I've been trying to communicate, collaborate, be understanding in that regard. And then when it's kind of like, oh, this is why, and you should just understand, well, now I have a problem with that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I had an experience, Destiny, yesterday with a learner, elementary age learner, where there's been a lot of like, la la la, we see nothing, we hear nothing, right? Except there's a million referrals and there's all, right, all the things, right? And so this young person had a 504, and there's just been all the things, right? So we finally go through the evaluation, and this young person was found eligible. And I will give some detail just because I think it's important to sort of understand the landscape. This learner was found eligible, primary autism, secondary OHI. They did not fall below the seventh percentile for like the speech language stuff, but there was an identified area of need in social communication. So that was lifted up along with several other areas of need: executive functioning, regulation, coping strategy, perspective, like all the things, right? And so the first meeting actually went relatively well. And so we were like, great. So we come back for this second part, and there is, I'm going to say, no love loss between the teacher of record and the family. And I'll just leave it at that. There's history there. It's not so great, right? And so it's an under-resourced district where they don't have the staff they need, right? And I think it's important to sort of name context, because I think that lots of teams, and I'm going to use the word team because I think it's families and school staff navigating this really complex landscape where, the speech paths are covering 2+ schools, right? OTs are at even more. Sometimes we even have special educators covering more than one campus, right? And so we are really limited with resources. And so we're kind of stuck in this position of having to be creative instead of creating and implementing an IEP with Fidelity that's really grounded in the individual learner's unique needs, right? And so there's some dynamics at play, both in terms of sort of staffing and interpersonal conflict among kind of between family and staff, right? So there's stuff that's going on. And so we get into this meeting, and we had identified about 4 or 5 areas of need in the initial meeting. And we had tried to exchange some information in between. We kind of got agreement around that. We had done our part. We had submitted goal and accommodation ideas to say, hey, this is what we're thinking. Wanted you to have an opportunity. They had sent a 5-page IEP with one goal in one area, and they were trying to make it so that the speech language pathologist was going to be the case manager for this learner, ignoring everything they had said at the prior meeting. We come into this space like, what is this? And every time we tried to lift up a concern about the learner and the area of identified need that we had already agreed upon, the teacher's ego was taking over the conversation, to the point that one of the parents, who is like super mellow and chill, was like, I'm out, and grabbed his stuff and walked out of the room. Mom was super close to joining him, but thought, shit, we were one man down. I better stay the course.
One of us has to finish it.
She's like, damn, stuff, right? But I typically remain relatively calm, but I got heated because I felt like on all these different levels, we were not engaging in this process with Fidelity, right? We were totally ignoring the needs of the learner. We were trying to skirt issues that are not skirtable. We were centering the process around a teacher's ego instead of who the learner was. And at some point, as respectfully as I humanly could, which probably needed some work, I'll own that, I was like, we're not engaging in this process with Fidelity. And the director of special ed, to her credit, called me out, and she's like, you seem like you're in your feels. And I said, I am in my feels, and this is why. I said, we are here to ground our conversation in this learner's needs, to create an individualized program for them, not have a teacher essentially let their ego drive the conversation, because we're not being truthful about who this learner is. We're not talking about her individual needs. We are focused on, like, the truth wasn't coming into the room, right? And so what we'd already agreed upon and identified was now no longer part of the conversation, which was really problematic. And so thankfully, the director stayed on a little bit longer after we adjourned the meeting. Teacher left, and we could have a more settled conversation. And she agreed. She agreed. And so we'll hopefully be moving forward with more fidelity. But sometimes it has to be named.
100%. And I think, first of all, if somebody would have told me I was in my feels, I would have lost my shit. Um,
You're damn right I'm in my feels. Y'all aren't doing this right.
yeah, I would have lost my shit. Um, no, but that's that piece, that's that collaboration piece where we look at also the advocacy, and then we look at having to kind of step into the fire, in my opinion, right? Because
Right.
we can be inquisitive, we can ask questions, we can kind of move around certain situations and dynamics and try and be very understanding. And then sometimes you just have to outright say it. And you just have to be like, hey, like, what's going on here? And I think that that's the piece that where you have to do that, is where you can't not call it out, especially when I think another thing that we're kind of getting out too is like weaponization of terms. And I think that that
Right.
happens so often where the parent is sitting here going like, no, you're right, like this should be going this way, and it takes that extra set of ears to be like, yes,
Right.
and
Yes.
you're bullshitting, right? And
Right.
I think that, going to that collaboration piece and how, like we said, this podcast is for everybody, right? It also comes to when you have other team members sitting there going,
Right.
and they can't
Right.
speak up, right? Because they're battling that these are like, you're a parent, I'm supporting your learner, I'm gonna keep supporting your learner, I'm gonna keep supporting them from a place of fidelity, right? But at the same time, these are people that I have to see every day, interact with every day, and especially if you have, we go back to that hierarchy, if you have somebody coming in going, oh, they're doing it with fidelity, and they're like, well, actually, right? Like, and
Right.
it's one of
Show
those,
me the data.
it's like they can't, speak up about it or speak to it. And I think that becomes a very uncomfortable position to be in. And
Yeah.
so, that other side of it is that you're not just calling it out, is that you're actually making sure that, and I love that you said, show me the data, because you're actually making sure that the data demonstrates the fidelity. I had a situation where the parent had brought me in. They were like, look, my learner needs compensatory services. I feel like my learner needs compensatory services. I know my learner needs compensatory services. And we get in the meeting and they're like, oh, okay, so, the learner was supposed to have, let's say they were like, the learner is supposed to have speech therapy, um, you know, once a week for 30 minutes. And, based on when we went without a speech therapist and when we hired a speech therapist, that would only mean this amount of compensatory services. And so, for those of you listening that don't know, compensatory services is provided when a learner is supposed to be receiving that service and does not, and the district agrees to provide that compensatory service. So, for example, we know in the state of education currently, so we've had learners. I mean, I know Lisa can, attest to this too. I've had learners where the school just didn't have a speech therapist.
Right.
And so it was like, we obviously have to make that up. The school didn't have an occupational therapist, but we have it identified that this learner is supposed to receive these services. In this case, they had, and this was a few years back now, they had a speech therapist. The speech therapist left. Then they were supposed to get a speech therapist. They didn't get a speech therapist. Then they got a speech therapist. But the speech therapist actually, when parent reached out via email documentation and said, hey, just seeing if you're working with my learner, actually said, no, I'll be starting with your learner on this week. So outside of that compensatory that was owed to all learners who had that in their IEP, which the district had formally sent out a letter, we'll have a meeting, we'll blah blah blah, acknowledging that. So kudos to them. There was
Absolutely.
also this gap in services once the speech therapist actually physically started on the campus.
Whoops.
They were like, oh, we only are going to account for this. And I said, well, we have this email here.
Right. Because our friend here was so generous and kind that they put it in writing.
And so then the principal was actually like, yep, yep, we're gonna, we're gonna go
Mm-hmm.
ahead and honor that. But that's that fidelity piece. And in that situation, when we talk about like that ill intent versus not, that
Right.
was not the case here. They were like, look, in our system, which is a whole other thing they have to deal with, in our system, it says, right, that this learner has been seen for this amount of time. And then we had the email subsequently saying, no, in fact, they had not. And so then they proceeded to provide compensatory services. But that was an example too, where you have this outside entity, right? And in this instance, it was the principal who was acting as the LEA, the local education agency representative. So they're supposed to know the policies and procedures and IDEA. That's why you have an LEA there, and who recognized, okay, we're seeing this in the system, but if they sent you that email, like, then we have to do it. And so she had the acting ability as the LEA to sign off on that. And she documented that and stated, like, if I'm questioned about it, I will subsequently show them this email that you were saying, because it was there in black and white. So,
Right.
that's kind of how we can see fidelity being implemented, attempting to be implemented, but not having all the pieces too. And I know sometimes, and that's something that
Right.
we've talked about as well.
No, absolutely. And back to something you were saying earlier that I think is really important is, and maybe I should have said it in the last episode, but apparently since the brain fog is just brain fogging, um, in that scenario where like in the actual meeting itself and a colleague is kind of derailing the process for whatever reason, I think you bring up such an important piece of that dynamic, which is in order for us to actually really be engaging in this process with fidelity. And obviously, if it's a program specialist, like if it's sort of the person in the highest status seat, this is tricky. But if it's somebody not, right, if it's the teacher or related service provider that's really derailing things, and the program specialist or the director or the principal doesn't step in and say, we're getting a little bit off track here, we need to, right, because they're uncomfortable,
Mm-hmm.
we're not engaging in the process with fidelity, right? And that was a little bit the situation yesterday was both, well, I think only the director like named it out loud, but the principal was also there, and I think he was in the same kind of situation. And then there were other folks around the table that when they had the opportunity to talk, you could like hear their frustration that like the conversation kept going sideways, but they wouldn't have been the voice at the table to say, hey, person in lateral position, like pull your stuff together.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think that if there is a director sitting at the table or there's a program specialist sitting at the table and there's somebody like from the school site team that is derailing the process, I
Mm-hmm.
almost feel like there's a reliance, if there's somebody like you or me in the room, there's a reliance on us to name that this is not going the way it's supposed to be going. And even though there was some prickly response yesterday, they didn't love that I called it out. Once like we were out of the official meeting and like there were just a few people left in the room, then the truth came out. Right. And I've had this happen. I have had school team members reach out to me either via email or via DM on Instagram to say, like, thank the Lord you were in that meeting today. Oh my gosh. Right. And they don't want to like throw their colleague under the bus, but like it is such an uncomfortable dynamic. But not only is it uncomfortable, it really sort of gets at this issue that we're not IEPing correctly,
Mm-hmm.
right? We're letting somebody's ego or somebody's agenda or whatever it is derail the process. And we are not, right? I mean, in the case yesterday, and it happens all the time, we didn't finish. So we have to do another round. And it's like, folks don't have time, right? Like doing the process with fidelity saves time.
Don't have time, don't have capacity.
Right.
I think one of the things that I found was like when we talk about fidelity, I know Lisa does the same. We draft letters and we have our family send them ahead of time and and I always say, I tell my families, I don't want my time wasted. I don't want your time wasted.
100%.
So I had a meeting last year, last school year, and we drafted the letter, we sent it, and we got in that meeting, and do you know they did not have any answers to our questions? They did not have any of the data. They had it in plenty of time. And the individual from the district, no, I'm sorry, excuse me, the principal actually said, I think that we're going to have to stop and hold another meeting.
Yeah.
She said, from what I am seeing, you all do not have any answers to any of the questions from the parent or Dr. Huff. You do not have the data that was requested. And I think that we need to get together and meet and then reconvene with the parents and their advocate.
I actually really appreciate that.
Same.
That to me is engaging in the process with fidelity, right?
Absolutely.
That is acknowledging, like, hey, wait a second, hold on, time out.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't come to the table prepared.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to own kind of our misstep here. We're going to remedy it by getting the data that you need, having the answers to your questions, etc. Why don't we take the time to get out our calendars? How much time do you need to get this data and get the answers to the questions? Let's let's do that and let's not waste everybody's time. I appreciate that.
Absolutely. And that was appreciated.
Yeah,
The
it's honest.
wasting our time by holding the meeting. And this was a situation where it was very already, we're doing everything that we can.
Of course you are.
And so this is a learner issue. There was a lot of ableism there. There was a lot of not understanding the learner. And, for context, ADHD, specific learning disabilities as well. So not understanding executive functioning, not understanding those underlying foundational skills where there's a struggle, where there's barriers. And so that's what we were combating.
Mhm.
Um, and absolutely, it was like when we got to that part where we got to really breaking down present levels and having that conversation, and that principal said that, and I mean, you could just see the daggers from the case manager's eyes, because the case manager had been the one who received the letter. The case manager had been the one who was like, yep, received it, acknowledged receipt of it, all those things. And of course parents were irritated. They were like, what?
Fair.
Like, why, what are we doing? But it was to me, like you said, that was the fidelity piece there, because it was like, she essentially, without saying it, was like, I'm sorry that we wasted your time. You
Mhm.
clearly sent this in advance. You clearly had specific questions and specific requests. You were requesting specific information that we should have, and
Yeah.
we did not do our due diligence. And I appreciated that underlying part of that, and acknowledging, like, hey, we didn't do our part here. And
Yeah.
we're gonna go back, and we're gonna come back, and we're gonna get it done.
100%. Right? It's like, when my kid was little, we went through several pediatricians for we had different folks who were like having their own medical stuff, right? Like it wasn't that we were necessarily like going through, but there's circumstantially, there was a lot of flux. And I liked some of them better than other, right? But we finally landed on this just wonderful, wonderful man. I loved him. When he told me he was retiring, I bumped into him in a grocery store and he told me, and I like burst into tears in the produce aisle. Like I loved this man. But what I loved most about him was he didn't pretend to know everything. Right. And so if I came to him, because we were there a lot, right? He would just say, are you okay with me checking in with a colleague? I think I'm on the right track, but I want, right? So to me, kind of that level of humility, that level of honesty, that level of like acknowledging you must be frustrated and we didn't do what we needed to do. Like, I would rather that than they like bullshitted their way through some meeting, made crap up, right? And then it wouldn't have been accurate. So then you would have had to come back. Like, sure, the family was irritated. They didn't show up with their questions answered. Fair enough. but they're going to be a whole lot more irritated if they get a bunch of garbage spewed at them while they're paying for their advocate to be there so that they can come back and pay again for their advocate to be there and their like time away from work or whatever, right? Like they're going to be a whole lot more irritated if time is wasted, right?
That
The
part.
honesty piece
Mhm.
helps. It's like we're human. We're learning. I miss up sometimes too. I'm frustrated, and it's okay for us to sit in this, like the discomfort of my frustration. And it's okay for you, case manager, to sit in the discomfort of you drop the ball,
That part.
right?
And there's some situations where, you have to be comfortable with that. I've had times where we're going through a draft and we get in the meeting and I'm like, that's not the same draft.
Right.
And I just
That's so
ask, like, because they're like telling us to follow along, and I'm just like, hey, is this the one that you sent the family? And then we subsequently figure out they've made updates since then. I don't go, oh, so you intentionally didn't provide them with a, you know what I mean? Like, it's not even that deep. I'm just like, okay, I just want to make sure I was following along, and they're usually like, I can send it to you right now, and not
perfect.
a problem. But I think what you're getting at too is that a lot of times as advocates, right, us entering into the space, we also get that kind of, we can't, the staff can feel like we can't own to a mistake because you're going to use it against us, right? And
Very
so
accurate.
that
Yeah.
can prevent them from being upfront and honest as well. And
Yeah.
so I think on to my advocates now, I'm saying, you have to come in that space more collaborative to give them the space to go, yeah, you know what? I did fuck up. Like,
Right. Right. No, it's so true. And I feel like um part of our job is to cue safety, right? Like
mhm,
it is to recognize that we're all here as learners and to like yes, we want to be collaborative, but we want to be curious about the learner and we're all learning along the way and we can be quick to laugh and right like all of that to me lends itself to a better IEP process that's done with more fidelity, right? If we're so worried we're going to get in trouble,
mhm,
right? Then the likelihood that the implementation piece is going to go well is less than it would be if we are creating safety during a meeting to say, okay, that sounds good, but can you walk me through what that looks like? I'm not sure. And that could be the parent asking that question. That could be the
mhm,
provider asking that question. This is how I'm kind of conceptualizing what that might look like. How does that sound to you? What does this currently look like right now? Right?
mhm.
Like at a meeting I had this morning, we were brainstorming, what para support could kind of look like. And the program specialist out of like kind of her butt just grabbed a time and was like, let's do this. And the teacher, it was super subtle, but her body kind of shifted. And mom was like super attuned. And so she said, well, what does it look like now? And do you think that's enough time? And so the teacher was able to kind of say, this is what it looks like now. And is there any way we can change that to longer? And she was like, her whole body was like, I mean, you can't see me unless you're watching me on YouTube, but like I'm curling in. She was like, is it okay if it's, and I looked at her and I said, it's whatever the learner needs. And this is a fluid document, so we can come back and tweak. But if you believe that this learner needs this amount of time, then that is what the offer should be. And like the program specialist was cringing, but I'm like, this is how you IEP. I'm gonna write a song.
100%.
I was gonna write a song about like when ego shows up at the IEP table, but they go together. It could be like an A and B track. When ego shows up at the IEP table, this is how you IEP. We could become songstresses or whatever, songwriters, whatever the right words are.
Oh my
Gosh.
goodness. Yes, no, that's 100%. So I think what we really wanted to get at today was just, again, there are ways for fidelity to show up, but again, I think what Lisa talks about, what comes to mind for me when she says cueing safety, I think that's something that neuroaffirming advocates do. right? We're always attuned to if everyone is feeling safe or comfortable. I know I'm always watching shifts and body language in the room, and I'm, virtually, and I'm checking in to see, and I'm asking, like, is that actually feasible to the person that's going to have to implement it?
Right.
And so when we're talking about that fidelity, we're talking about, school staff not using the term without actually knowing if it's being implemented. We're talking about instances where it is used with that ill intent behind it. And we're talking about instances where maybe there's a perception of fidelity, but it's not actually taking place. And so it's important for parents, when you are hearing the term fidelity be used, also to understand that it means that they are implementing things as written into the IEP. And that's why it's also very important that you have things written into the IEP the way in which they are supposed to be implemented.
Yes. Yes. I think my final thought will be to echo the need for specificity in the
Mhm.
IEP. And to share, I'm sure I've shared it multiple times here, but my favorite question to ask in an IEP meeting is, what does that look like? And you can change that up, but I think it really sort of goes hand in hand with that specificity so that we can make sure that we're writing the IEP in a way that really sort of captures that implementation so that we increase the likelihood that it will be implemented as designed.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, thank you for joining us on this episode. Again, listen on Spotify, listen on Apple Podcasts, or watch us on YouTube, and we will talk to you next time.
See you next time.
Thank you again for joining us here in the Affirming Village. We're your co-hosts, Dr. Destiny Huff and Lisa Wright, and we hope today's conversation leaves you feeling seen, supported, and better equipped to advocate for yourself or your learner. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share this with someone else in the village. Until next time, keep advocating, keep affirming, and keep building the village we all deserve.